Imagine losing everything you love, and in the darkest moment of your life, finding an unexpected reason to move on. Beatrice, a homeless woman, lived invisible to the eyes of the world, until the day she met Tomas, a lost and helpless boy. What started as a simple gesture of kindness turned into a connection that no one could predict. Meanwhile, Gustavo, Tomas's father, fought for his life in a hospital, unaware of his fate. Son was in the hands of a stranger. But wait. What happens when such opposing worlds collide? How can a woman discredited by everyone become the heroine of a story that no one would dare imagine? Stay until the end, because this is a story of courage, love, and transformation that will challenge everything you believe about the power of second chances. The rain was falling heavily that night, obscuring Gustavo's vision as he drove along the highway. His thoughts were far away, occupied with work and the decisions he would need to make the next day. A sudden sound of a horn brought him back to reality, but it was too late. The headlights of a truck flashed in front of him, and the impact was immediate. The sound of twisting metal and breaking glass echoed in the night. Gustavo barely had time to understand what was happening before he lost consciousness. When he opened his eyes briefly, flashes of red lights and the muffled sound of voices in the background were all he noticed before absolute silence. Meanwhile, Tomas, her 7-year-old son, waited at home. The nanny had left him in the living room with a simple dinner and the promise that Gustavo would be back soon. The clock on the wall seemed to move slower, and the hours passed without news. When news of the accident arrived, the house was taken over by Gustavo's relatives, but their focus was not on the boy. His concerns revolved around financial issues and legal responsibilities. Tomas, who was watching everything from afar, felt completely ignored. He expected to hear something about his father, but the conversations were cold and disconnected. After 2 days of confusion, the boy decided to act. Without really understanding where he was going, he left through the back door and started walking through the streets, calling for his father. Beatrice found him sitting in an alley, huddled among cardboard boxes. She was carrying a bag with some empty bottles and worn-out clothes. When he saw Tomas, he frowned, approaching carefully. "Hey, kid, what are you doing here?" he asked, leaning down to his level. His voice was firm but not rude. Tomas raised his face, his eyes red from crying. I don't know where my father is." Beatrice sighed, looking around. "And your mother? Does she know you're here?" Tomas shook his head, holding his knees to his chest. "My mother left a long time ago." Beatrice placed her hands on her hips. "Excellent. Looks like you're stuck with me now. It's not exactly a prize, but we'll figure it out." Even with her own life in ruins, Beatrice decided to help Tomas. She took him to her little refuge under a bridge, where she laid a thin blanket on the cement floor. Pulling a piece of stale bread from the bag, she handed it to the boy. "Sorry, kid, but today's menu is pretty limited. Bread with nothing," she said, eliciting a weak smile from Tomas. "But if you want, I can include an amazing story for dessert." Tomas accepted the bread and began to chew. Even dry, he was grateful. "You're funny," he murmured. "Wait until you hear about the time I almost became a millionaire," Beatrice replied, winking. "But first, we need to think about how to keep you out of trouble." That night, while Tomas slept under a torn blanket, Beatrice watched him thoughtfully. "I've faced a lot, but taking care of a child may be my biggest challenge," she whispered to herself. She knew the situation was temporary, but something about the boy awakened in her a sense of responsibility that she had long forgotten. As difficult as it was, Beatrice felt that caring for Tomas was more than a duty. It was a chance to rediscover her own strength. Beatrice woke up to the sound of hurried footsteps above the bridge. She blinked a few times, adjusting to the dim light of dawn, and turned to see Tomas, still sleeping, curled up in the blanket she had arranged the night before. The boy seemed calmer, but his expression still carried the sadness of being away from his father. "Good morning, boy," said Beatrice, giving Tomas a slight shake. "Waking up late is not part of our plan. We have a full day ahead." Tomas opened his eyes slowly, and for a moment he seemed disoriented. When he saw Beatrice, he felt comforted. "What are we going to do today?" he asked, rubbing his eyes. "Survive," replied Beatrice with an ironic smile. "Don't worry, I'm great at this. But first, let's get something better than dry bread for breakfast." The pair began walking around the city. Beatrice took Tomas to a community center where they sometimes distributed breakfast to homeless people. While they waited in line, Tomas observed the environment, visibly uncomfortable. "Do you come here often?" he asked softly. "When necessary," replied Beatrice, "but let me warn you right away, their porridge is so bad that you miss dry bread." Tomas laughed, which made Beatrice smile too. Despite the situation, she knew that humor was her best tool to keep the boy calm. After eating, Beatrice took Tomas to a small park nearby. Sitting on a bench, she began telling him stories about her life, improvising details to keep him entertained. "Did you know that I almost became famous once?" she said, crossing her arms. "Famous how?" asked Tomas, curious. "I was in a singing competition. I sang so well that the entire audience was silent, or maybe because the sound system broke and no one heard me. Anyway, it was a disaster." Tomas laughed loudly this time. For the first time, he felt a little less alone. Beatrice noticed the change and insisted on continuing with the funny stories. But deep down, Beatrice knew that the situation was not sustainable. While Tomas played with some fallen leaves, she thought about how to protect the boy. "I don't know how long I can do this for him," she muttered to herself, "but for now, he has me, and that will have to be enough." In the park, while Tomas played with branches that he transformed into imaginary swords, Beatrice watched from afar, sitting on a bench. Her thoughts were distant, but Tomas's voice brought her back to reality. "Look, Beatrice, I'm a knight fighting a giant dragon," he shouted, waving the branch in the air. "Careful, knight," she replied with a smile. "That dragon looks tough. You will need reinforcements." Tomas laughed and continued playing. Beatrice knew that, even in that difficult situation, it was important for the boy to have moments of fun. But the momentary peace was interrupted when some people in the park started to notice the two. A lady approached, frowning. "Is he your son?" asked the woman, with a suspicious tone. Beatrice stood up, remaining calm. "Not exactly. I'm taking care of him for now." The lady looked at Tomas and then at Beatrice, clearly judging the situation. "Do you think this is appropriate? A woman like you on the streets taking care of a child?" Beatrice crossed her arms, trying to control her irritation. "Well, ma'am, if you think a roof automatically makes someone a good person, maybe you should meet the people who neglected it before I showed up." The woman backed away, uncomfortable with the direct answer, but said nothing more. Tomas, noticing the discomfort, ran to Beatrice. "Is everything okay?" he asked, holding your hand. "Sure, kid," she said, gently squeezing his hand. "Some people just don't know how to keep their opinions to themselves." But the interaction did not go unnoticed. A man with a camera started taking photos, drawing attention to the two. "Look, this would make a great story. Homeless woman takes care of lost child," he said out loud, laughing. Beatrice felt her heart accelerate. She didn't want exposure, much less nasty comments. Holding Tomas by the hand, he quickly left the park. That night, while Tomas slept, Beatrice thought about the future. "Maybe I should get real help. I can't go on like this forever." But the idea of being separated from Tomas made her uneasy. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she had a purpose, and she wasn't ready to give it up. After months in a coma, Gustavo slowly opened his eyes. The white light of the hospital room felt unbearable, and he needed a moment to process where he was. He tried to move his body, but everything felt heavy. It was then that a nurse noticed he had woken up. "Welcome back, Mr. Gustavo," she said, adjusting the monitors next to her bed. "You've been gone for quite a while." "How, long?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Almost 3 months," replied the nurse in a calm tone, "but don't worry, you are in recovery." Gustavo took a moment to process the information. His mind, however, immediately went to the most important person in his life. "My son, where is Tomas?" The nurse hesitated, but kept her tone reassuring. "He's fine, he's safe, but there is something you need to know." In the following days, as he regained his strength, Gustavo learned what had happened. Tomas had disappeared shortly after the accident, and no one in his family could explain how he ended up on the streets. It was an unknown woman, a homeless woman named Beatrice, who found him and took care of him. Determined to find out who this woman was and what had happened, Gustavo pressured the doctors to let him leave the hospital as quickly as possible. Even though he was still weak, his determination led him to the shelter where Beatrice and Tomas were. When Gustavo arrived, he saw Tomas playing with other children in the courtyard. Upon seeing him, the boy ran towards him, shouting, "Dad!" The hug was strong, and Gustavo couldn't hold back the tears. He held his son as if he was afraid of losing him again. After the emotional reunion, his eyes turned to Beatrice. She watched from afar, her arms crossed, an expression difficult to decipher. Gustavo approached, with a mixture of gratitude and distrust. "So, you're the woman who took care of my son?" he asked, trying to keep his tone steady. Beatrice didn't back down. "Yes, I am. And before you ask, I did it because he needed it. Nobody else cared." Gustavo felt a pang of shame, but tried to hide it. "And why should I believe you?" Before Beatrice could respond, Tomas intervened, placing himself between the two. "Dad, she helped me. She gave me food, told me stories. You can't talk to her like that." The boy's defensive tone caught Gustavo by surprise. He took a deep breath, looking at Beatrice again. "I just want to understand. How could someone like you, who already has her own problems, decide to take care of a child she didn't even know?" Beatrice shrugged, but there was sincerity in her voice. "Because he needed it. And maybe I needed it too." For a moment, Gustavo was unable to respond. Her words echoed something he hadn't expected to hear. He knew that without her, Tomas could have faced a much worse fate. "I don't know how to thank you," he said finally, in a softer tone. "But I want to hear more." Gustavo watched Beatrice while Tomas played with other children in the shelter's courtyard. He was still processing everything that had happened. It was not just the fact that Beatrice took care of her son, but how, facing difficulties that he could not even imagine. "Beatrice, tell me more about yourself. I want to understand why you did all this, even when it seemed impossible," he asked, his voice softer now. Beatrice sighed, looking at Gustavo as if trying to decide how much to share. "Look, it's not a story I like to tell, but I think you deserve to know. I didn't always live like this, you know. I had a family, a home, even a job that made me happy." She paused, looking at the horizon. Gustavo realized the depth of her pain and didn't stop it. "Everything changed when I lost my husband. A car accident. He was everything to me. After that, it was a series of disasters. I lost my house, my job, and ended up on the streets. I knew what it was like to lose everything, including hope. So when I found Tomas, I saw in him a chance to do something I couldn't do on my own, save someone." Her words echoed in Gustavo's heart. He felt small compared to what Beatrice had faced and what he had done for Tomas. "You didn't just take care of him," said Gustavo, with emotion in his voice. "You gave him something that even I couldn't at that moment. Hope." "I didn't do this expecting thanks or rewards," she replied with a shy smile. I did it because it was right. And if you must know, he helped me too. It gave me a reason to continue, to fight, even when there seemed to be no reason left. Tomas, realizing that the two were talking, ran towards them. Dad, do you know what Beatrice told me? She already fought a dragon, he said, laughing and holding her hand. Beatrice laughed. Careful, boy. Dragons don't like us spreading their stories around. Gustavo laughed too, feeling a lightness he hadn't experienced in months. He looked at Beatrice and saw something else, a strength and kindness that he didn't find in many people. Beatrice, he began with a more serious tone, I can't just let you go back to the street. What you did for Tomas, for what you did for me without even knowing it, deserves more than words. I want to help her start over. Beatrice raised her eyebrows in surprise. This seems too good to be true. Are you telling me that now I'm going to live in a mansion too? I'm not going to promise you a mansion, Gustavo joked, but I want you to have a real chance to start over. A house, a job, and, who knows, a new family. She was silent for a moment, clearly emotional. I don't know what to say. Say you accept, and that he's going to tell Tomas more stories about dragons, replied Gustavo, smiling. A few weeks later, Beatrice moved into a simple but cozy house, rented by Gustavo. He also invited her to work on a social project he created, focused on helping homeless people. Beatrice accepted with enthusiasm, becoming the leader of the project, with Tomas always by her side. During one of the meetings, Gustavo joked, You know that I'm just the investor now, right? You're the boss. Beatrice laughed, something she did more often now. Don't worry, Gustavo. I'll make sure our ship keeps flying, and if there's a problem, I'll fix it myself. The three, a millionaire, a formerly homeless woman, and a boy full of dreams, formed an unlikely family. They proved that love, compassion, and determination can transform lives in unexpected and profound ways.